Hi, it's Dennis Daily. It's a shame that when you travel the interstate, you just pass by all the tourist attractions. Well, I didn't do that when I went to Jackson, Tennessee, and Casey Jones Village. They're ringing the bell on engine 352, Casey Jones engine, here at the Casey Jones Village in Jackson, Tennessee, and the country store, and it's just magnificent. I began our tour by talking to the son of one of the two men who started all of this, Clay Shaw.
My father was Brooke Shaw. In fact, my father was born in a log cabin back in 1924, in an original log cabin. His family was quite poor at the time, and his father had lost his farm, and he had moved in with my great-grandparents, and so he was born of a rural heritage, and he grew up in and around an old country store. In fact, his first job as a boy was working in an old country store. In fact, he used to joke that he used to eat all the cheese and crackers he could, and probably he used to eat more cheese and crackers than he got paid for, but it was and so his employer lost money, but he really loved that time and that era of the days of the early American country store, when they used to sit around the old pot-bellied stove and play checkers and eat cheese and crackers, and just really was a place of community. And so he worked there, and then later he moved here to Jackson, Tennessee, and became the head of a canned meat company, and eventually health problems caused him to look for some other things to do. The doctors advised him to get a hobby, and a friend gave him 3 Southern country antiques, and he started collecting these antiques, and literally between 1960 and 65 amassed about 15,000 Southern country antiques and opened up our original Brooke Shaw's Old Country Store.
I think we need to talk about, before we went on the air, you mentioned to me that so many of the things that were a part of American life, even up into the 40s and 50s, started being thrown out in the 1960s because everything got modern, people got television sets, and there was a temptation to think anything old was useless. But if people such as your dad hadn't gone out and saved that, a lot of that would have been lost.
You're exactly right. In fact, his friends used to tease him and say, "Brooks, why are you throwing away good money after all this old junk that people are literally throwing out their back doors?" In fact, we have old telephones, the old wall telephones, that the telephone company used to pick up, go door to door and pick up, and literally by the dump truck load throw them into ditches. Now these old phones are worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars each, but that was what was happening at the time when the technology was changing and the country was changing, but he, I think, recognized that there was going to be something special about these antiques, and at a time when people were throwing them away, he was collecting them, and now and again he amassed literally over 15,000 of them from all over the United States.
The other day I was in Northern California near Truckee and did a lot of driving around. I love to do that on back roads. And I went into this little town like Vinton or something, I think, and went in to get a bottle of pop, for those of you not from the Midwest, a soft drink. And I went in and I found the most incredible store. And I complimented the woman on it because it did not quite have the inventory this place had. But they were so far away from the nearest city, which would have been Reno, they literally needed one of everything there. And I think today in our Kmart, Walmart generation, we forget that people were more isolated, and when they did get into the store, whether it was a button or a piece for a plow, the fellow who owned the store had to have that.
That's exactly right. I mean, the country store of that day encompassed everything that a community would need. I mean, everything from food to clothing and things for the farm and everything in between. And so it truly was a place of community, and there's just such a nostalgia about a country store, and we've tried to recapture that here as much as we can within our old country store, and it's a tribute to Mom's home cooking and Pop's old country store is what it is.
I don't want to digress too far here, but I want to tell you about a situation. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years in an part of Arlington, Virginia, called Roslyn, right across from Georgetown. And we had a Safeway grocery, and they tore it down to build an office building. And a bunch of us got together one day and said, we don't have any place to meet now. Our little community, our little neighborhood has no sense of unity. So we lobbied the city council, and they ended up forcing the developer to put a Safeway in the basement. And it was weird. It was either a Safeway with its own parking garage or a parking garage that had a Safeway in it. But suddenly when they opened that, we started meeting familiar faces. I mean, I really think for the psyche of a person, you have to have that sense of community. And you're right. The country store, which often was the post office also, was where people met.
That's exactly right. In fact, we've had a group here that's of old timers, community leaders that have been meeting here for probably 30 years. They gather here every morning at 9 o'clock and drink coffee and solve the problems of the world every morning, have been for many, many years. So it is a place of gathering, and it's a wonderful place, and we're just we're so thankful and grateful for all the people from all over the world who come here.
Clark, I want to ask about the reaction you get, but I want you to introduce me to this fellow over here. I understand that your late father tapped this guy's brain and his energy at a very important time.
My dad's bad health did not permit him to actually run the old country store when he founded it in 1965, and he was also running this other company called Kelly Foods Canned Meat Company, and so he hired Norwood Jones to come and be his original storekeeper. And Norwood has been with the company now for 34 years and is now one of the owners of our business, and we're just so proud of him. In fact, I have said, when my dad died when I was 16 years old and my sister was 14, my mother didn't really know a lot about the business, but Norwood was managing the company from 1965 until 71 when my dad died, and he continued to operate the place as if it were his own, and even though he was not an owner at that time. And so we were so grateful to him for all he had done, and we made him an owner 20 plus years ago, and we're so glad. And then I've said, Dennis, many times that there would not be this old country store here today if it wasn't for Norwood Jones and his wonderful dedication. So he's a great guy.
That's quite a kindness on his part.
But it's true.
Clark's dad was really a very unselfish man. His whole purpose in this store was to preserve a lot of the things that were used or sold in the old general stores at the turn of the century, and operated in kind of an old-fashioned flavor of giving good measure at a fair price, and to save it for future generations kind of come in and look at it and appreciate how the old general merchant of the turn of the century did business.
Let me ask you, what is the reaction you get from two areas? First of all, from visitors from out of the United States, for example, who are walking back in time almost when they see this, and from kids who are walking into something that they haven't maybe even read about, that they don't realize that people in our generation who are still alive when we were kids, you could go and see this.
They're really kind of amazed that we've been able to amass what we have here and preserve it like we have. And it's for future generations to see and appreciate, and the young kids enjoy it as much as the older folks. Of course, it's a lot of nostalgia for the older folks to come in and see things that they used to see buy or use, and that they could pick up in an old store here, and it's kind of a nostalgia in that the fact that a lot of big retail stores of today started out as a little country store like ours originally started out as. J.C. Penney, Sears and Roebuck, they were all little country stores like this in the beginning.
Well, something over my shoulder here reminds me of a really large part of merchandising years ago. You have an old sewing machine over there.
Oh, yeah.
I think... And I say this because I went to a sewing machine museum in Arlington, Texas many years ago, where a fellow had one of every type of sewing machine ever made. He said, you don't realize how before the invention of the sewing machine, how much time women particularly spent sewing. Mm-hmm. But I would presume because so many people had to make their own things, that the ability of the country store to get the kind of cloth you needed, the sewing materials, that was a pretty important part of the merchandising.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, the general store was everything for the community. It was the place to get your news. When you come to town, you find out what's going on in the community just by coming to the country store. The general store, they actually served as the funeral parlor. They sold caskets and everything from that to a very rare thing we've got up here is a chicken duster. I don't know whether you've seen that or not, but we've got a chicken duster up here that's a really rare thing.
Can you explain for a family audience how you use a chicken duster?
Well, what they would do, they would take an old hen and that might have had chicken lice or mites, and take an old hen and stick him in this bucket. And the only thing that could stick out of that bucket is the chicken's head, and then it has a pump on the side that they'd fill him full of dust and get rid of the chicken mites there too.
Oh my goodness!
Another kind of rare item that we have in the store that would be something that very interesting. It's a hog bladder filled with Garrett snuff. This is a very rare item that we have in the store. This is the way the snuff dealers used to buy and sell their snuff and keep it fresh. They would pack it in a hog bladder, send it into the merchant. The merchant would keep it until he was ready to sell it. Then he would take his pocket knife, cut a hole in the top of that bladder, and dip the snuff out and put it in the lady's snuff pouch when she came in. And then so much a spoonful would go in their snuff pouch.
Now, for those who may not know, snuff is finely ground tobacco.
That's right, finely ground tobacco.
And you see the movies in which they'll show our forefathers would take a little bit and.
That's right,
and now we throw people in jail for doing something rather similar to that. Over here, there is a beautiful instrument. It is a player piano. I don't quite know how to describe it. It's cherry wood or something similar, and it looks as if it's more than just a player piano. It's got I almost see shades of Lionel Hampton there. It's got a vibraphone inside.
Well, it's got actually 9 instruments in there. It's that all of them play during its. When it comes on.
Well, you tell me that it's got a little glitch, though. You can't get it to stop without unplugging it now.
Unfortunately, we've got it's set up to put in 2 quarters and then you play it. But now you put in 2 quarters and it never stops. So we have to unplug it before we run our.
Well, let's see. Can we plug it in here? There go the lights.
There's the lights. Let's see what we've got from here.
All right, you're opening the
let's see
lid there.
Here.
I don't want you to tear it up. Now, this dates from about when?
Well, really, this is kind of a new item. It's but it's a
replica
of the real old player piano.
So in an age before even the invention of the phonograph, and certainly before radio, CDs, everything else we take for granted now, this would be a neat form of entertainment. You come in and put your money in. I hear something.
Maybe we've got it to working.
Oh, okay, let's listen here a little bit. I was going to say, you could leave that on all the time, but as delightful as that is, after a while...
Our cashiers do get enough of it sometimes.
Yeah, she's right behind there. Hi. How would you like to have that going all the time?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, here, let's walk away. I want to see some more of the store here. One of the things that you cannot pass up here, and you have your own brand, and boy, now that I'm not supposed to have much sugar, I shouldn't even be here, is that every time I've gone to a classic store like this, there is so much food, so many canned preserves. And a lot of these, here you have vanilla, but the bottles look like something out of an old doctor's office from the 1800s.
We're a Watkins product agent. You know, Watkins products go back.
You even have liniment here.
Back into the early 1900s, and they still make that product, and we've got it here at the Old Country Store. In fact, this is probably one of the kind of the rare things that you'll ever find. It's the old display rack that the Watkins rep would take into your home and show you his wares.
It's a wooden traveling case.
Wooden traveling case is what it is. Yeah. And this is a very good item for us. We sell a lot of that. Surprising, a lot of people still remember it and come and buy Watkins products.
There used to be out east, way up in the Maryland mountains, a store in a little town called Wilson, Maryland, where the fellow had collected all of these beautiful signs like mail pouch tobacco and some of those from years ago. And you remember, you drive around the Midwest, you used to see barns, would be billboards. Companies would go around, they say, we'll pay you so much to paint your barn. Well, anyway, there was a beautiful store, and about 20 years ago, I was up in the Maryland mountains, and I took a great color photograph of this huge display of signs. I was through there about 5 years ago. They're all faded now, and the place is falling down, but I still have that photograph. But that's a good example. You got to preserve stuff. If you let it go, it's gone.
You really do. And you know, something I kind of enjoy doing is when I find an old store that still has a faded out sign on the side of it, I try to take a picture of that, because some of those signs, I don't know what kind of paint they used way back there, but some of those signs are still available that have been up there 50 years. In fact, one downtown Jackson is on the wall, still there.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think if people will think about this, they may have to be in a rural area to see this, is that you'll see a modern day sign, let's say from the 60s or so, that has already faded, but the sign that was behind it from 1920, you can still read it.
Still read the sign, you sure can. I don't know what kind of paint they used, but they used some.
Well, it was lead-based, I think. Yes.
Lead-based paint that you probably couldn't use today. Something kind of interesting that you might like to see is this. This is a portable pantry. This is a pantry that the wagon trains would have on their kitchen wagon, and they carry their spices and their flour and sugar and all, and on the wagon train. And this thing here would sit on the back of the wagon, and they use it to do their cooking. When
it's kind of in a way, it has the feeling it's a safe. It's very secure.
Yeah, and they carried it on the wagon trains across the country.
Well, now let's move over here if we can. There's so much I would safely say that you have collected so much stuff here that you could spend a week and not see everything.
You're absolutely right. Hey, while we're looking, you might want to look at that hog bladder right there. Have you see it there?
Yeah, there it is.
There it is, yeah.
You don't see many hog bladders anymore.
No, you don't really see many hog bladders, especially full of fresh snuff, you know.
Now, here we go. Here is behind glass. This is more than a store. It's a museum. We have a jacket actually worn by Sunset Kit Carson.
Yes, Sunset Carson was on location in Kentucky, filming up in Kentucky at one time, and he gave this jacket to a girlfriend that he'd met up in Kentucky, and Brooke Shaw was able to get a hold of it, and we brought it into here and displayed it here in the store as a Kit Carson actually lived in Jackson, Tennessee when he died. And we're very proud to have the article here.
You know, there's something we need to talk about here. I'm looking, it's behind glass, at this jacket, which has so much ornate leather work and metal buttons and everything on it. If you look at even a farm implement from the 1800s, or an old ornate fire truck. There's a beautiful fire truck in the California Museum in Oakland that was used to help fight the San Francisco fire that is not only functional, it's a work of art. That the back of this cash register, that so many of the things of everyday life were made with such loving attention back then that even a plow had a design on it.
It did. You're absolutely right. And the bean counter here that we have right at the entrance here to the store here, this is something that's a very rare item, but it's actually a usable thing. You notice the beans that are displayed in the front, they have a corresponding drawer in the behind, and the merchant would sell it by the pound or by the half a pound or whatever beans you needed. Yeah.
Now, what is this over here? We're going back over to where the the area was where they were carrying things on the wagon. This is a machine. It's beautiful. What does it do?
This is actually a coffee grinder. Now, this is kind of although it's dates back to the early 1900s, it's electric. It's an electric coffee grinder that you put the coffee beans up here, and it turns on and it grinds the coffee. And also, this is the earlier model.
Yeah,
this
it's
is
got the two big wheels on each side.
Grinder.
Now, you know, I don't always mean to sound like a teacher lecturing here, but I think this might be a good time to remind the younger audience that it has only been in my lifetime that electricity came to a lot of rural America.
Absolutely right. You're right.
And here in this area, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, did an awful lot damming up the rivers. They killed two birds with one stone. They stopped the flooding and they generated electricity. But when you said that this was an electric coffee grinder, I'm thinking that during the era when it was made, really it was only available in big cities that they had lights.
You're right. Absolutely right. Electricity didn't get out into the rural areas until TVA mainly.
I have a question. We've got so much to see in so little time. I want to walk over here and ask about something, and I should know the answer to this because I lived in Virginia for 20 years. But you have cured hams hanging up here, and this is these are about the size of a football and a half, is the best way I describe it.
They are.
But they're not refrigerated. They're completely cooked and then dried.
They're salt cured, the old-fashioned way of curing a country ham. This is actually a real, what we call a real Tennessee country ham. It's salt cured, hickory smoked, and aged for about 9 months before we sell. And this particular ham we've been buying from the same man who cures them for the past 34 years.
Good heavens.
Yeah.
And here again is an example of in the days before refrigeration, so many foods were preserved differently than we're used to now.
Oh, I tell you, it's so much different. I remember when Mama didn't have a refrigerator at all. We did our refrigeration with ice.
Well, I still call it an ice box. I don't call it a refrigerator.
Ice. And hey, none of the health rules today would work yet, but back in my days, because they just were completely different.
You know, they're going through a problem. I can't remember whether it's Ohio or Pennsylvania. There's an Amish sect, could be Mennonite, which owns a dairy in one of those states where they have traditionally kept the milk cool by putting it into cellars and using well water, because they don't believe in refrigeration. And the state says that it's something like 2 degrees too warm. So they're going. But you're right. You know, it's a wonder people didn't get ill more often back then.
It really is. There's no way to have kept it refrigerated like they do today.
Let's go to a couple of other areas, but before we have to call it quits here, this was all started by Mr. Clark around the idea of antiquing. And what you've done is you have carried the simple idea of antiques to not having an antique item, but really an antique location.
You're right. Well, what he wanted to do was preserve a lot of the items that were either sold or used in the old stores of the turn of the century, and that's our main goal, is that all the items that we use for display are items that were either sold or used in the general store of the turn of the century.
So we're talking about late 1800s, right across, right at 100 years ago now.
Yeah.
I wonder if back then they were worrying about the millennium. Well, no, it wouldn't have been the millennium, but I wonder if there were
Y2K
if there were doomsayers back in 1899 who thought, 1900 the world's going to come to an end.
I doubt if they ever had any thought of anything like that.
Well, they didn't have computer problems.
Yeah.
Here is a washboard. And here's another thing you can't explain to a kid. It's corrugated metal. That before the days of the washing machine and the automatic agitator, you had to shove your clothes down that thing.
Really, I've seen my mother do it many times. She would wash clothes. She'd heat the water in a big iron pot outside, and then turn it up into a galvanized tub and wash our clothes in that. Women don't realize how well they have it today.
Well, I can remember, as you probably can too, sitting with my grandmother endlessly snapping beans. It'd be harvest time, and we'd have to clean those darn green beans up.
Yeah, it really doesn't take long to look around this old store and see how people used to have to do their chores to find out when the good old days are. The good old days are right now.
You know, here's let me walk around here. Here's something I want to bring back with me. I don't know why, of all the items you have here, this caught my eye. It's basically, what is it, just a big soup ladle?
Oh, those are water dippers.
Okay.
I can tell you're still a young fellow there because you don't remember a water dipper. This is the way you used to get your water. You'd go to the spring and get a bucket full of water and bring it up, or go to the well. You'd get it out of the ground, and you'd have a community water bucket that everybody drank the water out of the same dipper, you know?
Now, that was healthy.
Yeah. You probably moved around one side to the other as you dip, but...
Actually, they got back then what they called, we call it colliery. Right. Now I can see John Wayne out dipping. Let's see, where else can we go here? We've got a section here where you've got some wonderful purchasable memorabilia and little cards and antiques, and a whole section on Coca-Cola. Isn't Coca-Cola memorabilia a big business now? Boy,
it is a big business these days. It's one of the biggest collector items there is on the market today. Coca-Cola goes so far back. I can remember even, we were talking about the price of Coke. Even when we opened the stores in 1965, you could buy a Coca-Cola for 6 cents and a package of gum for a nickel. And so things have changed a lot.
Well, now here is a reproduction of an original Coca-Cola bottle. This doesn't have that Gibson girl, that's what I call it, shape that we're so familiar with. It looks as if it would have had a cork or some type of wire seal on the top of this originally.
That is very similar to the one of the original old Coke bottles back in the turn of the century. And I didn't even realize we had it for sale here. But these are reproductions. We do have some of the real things that in our cases here, though.
Well, the glass bottle is almost a thing of the past now. I saw some statistics the other day on how almost everything is going to be aluminum cans.
Yeah, I don't know how we let that happen.
I don't know how we let a lot of things happen.
How we let a good glass bottle of Coke and soda get away from us, I don't know.
Let me move over here and get out of the way. I don't want to block your customers, and let's wrap things up by getting into an area that's very dear to my heart. Every little town has some kind of history, and I want to get Clark Shaw in on this too. You have done such a great job here. What would you give as advice to somebody who's in a small town? Maybe there's an old school, or maybe the city has a railroad heritage, or maybe it was a pottery making area at one time, about making sure that you grab that heritage before it's all gone.
Well, I tell you, that is so important to do. I mean, again, the sense of community we talked about earlier. You know, for example, in our own hometown here in Jackson, Tennessee, we've got a beautiful old historic downtown, a lot of old historic buildings where they need to be saved and preserved, because, you know, I cannot imagine, you know, calling your community where the modern part of it is. I mean, your heritage in your downtown is the heart of your community, and then you grow out from your heart, and that's the way we feel about it. And you can never build that. You've just got to have it, you know, and it's there, and you need to preserve it. And so you just need to look for those things in your own community that you can call your own, that are a real point of difference that no one else has. I mean, Jackson, Tennessee is very fortunate to have Casey Jones to call its own. Carl Perkins, the king of rockabilly music and author of Blue Suede Shoes and Daddy Sang Bass, we can call him. Jackson calls his hometown as well. So, but every community just about has something unique and different that they can call their own. They need to figure out what that is and then build on it from there.
And I don't mean to sound mercenary, but people are crying to go back to their roots. And if a town finds something that becomes a tourist attraction and brings a few people in and helps the motels or the local restaurant, there's nothing wrong with that.
That's very true. I follow up Clark on that we really need to preserve these little things of memorabilia or family things that we have around for future generations to see and appreciate what may have been happening in years past. And I suggest that, hey, try to save anything that connects with your family and preserve it and write it down, write a little history about it and paste it underneath it so you'll know what's going on.
One more question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. We're at the country store here at Casey Jones area, Jackson, Tennessee. I spent the night last night in a refurbished caboose, which was absolutely wonderful. I'd spent the night on a tugboat once, but now I've spent the night in a caboose. There's a great store where they sell model trains. Wonderful place here. You got a great restaurant. You have a reproduction of Casey Jones' engine. We need, before leaving, to have you remind us just who Casey Jones was and what that story is.
Well, I tell you, to us, it's one of the great stories in American history. When you think about what happened in 1900 and how the legend of Casey Jones came about. Casey Jones was a real person, first of all, Dennis. I mean, a lot of people think that he was the figment of some writer's imagination, but he really did live. I mean, a lot of people that come into our museum think, well, I thought he was like Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill.
You've got his house here.
We have his house here in the home that he lived in with his wife and 3 children at the time of his death in 1900. But he was just a hard-working railroad man who loved his family, loved his work. But he got caught up on the night of April the 30th, 1900, in an extraordinary circumstance. He was on his way down to Vaughn, Mississippi, down to Canton, Mississippi, from Memphis, Tennessee, and he was engineering a passenger train. And his fireman, Sim Webb, looked out the side of the cab of the engine as they were almost at their destination, and Sim Webb said, "Oh my Lord, there's something on the main line ahead." Casey jumped up, looked out the cab, and saw the red lights of a caboose of another train on the main track. And then Casey did everything he could to slow the train down. He reversed the brakes and applied the throttle, reversed the throttle and emergency brakes, and started blowing the whistle. And then he yelled across the cab of the engine for Sim to jump, Sim, jump. And Sim jumped out off the cab of his engine about 300 feet before the trains crashed into one another. But Sims came through that. He lived through that, but Casey stayed at his post, trying desperately to slow the train down. Was unsuccessful in doing that, however, and he crashed literally through the end of a caboose, through a carload of hay and corn, and halfway through a carload of timber. His engine left the track and crashed into an embankment. But Casey Jones was the only person killed in the train crash, and all of the lives of his passengers were saved by his heroic efforts. And out of that, I mean, there were an awful lot of people. 2,000 people were killed in 1900 in train-related accidents. So his was just another statistic until an African-American engine wiper named Wallace Saunders, who worked in the roundhouses of Canton, Mississippi. He had a knack of coming up with these catchy little tunes that as he cleaned the engines would sing there in the roundhouse. And he started singing one about his old lost friend, Casey Jones. And then another man who worked in the roundhouse had 2 brothers in vaudeville called the Layton Brothers. He gave this song to his brothers. They put it in their vaudeville act. It became a rage of the vaudeville circuit. Finally, a couple of songwriters named Shebert and Newton in Los Angeles put the song in sheet music, and from there it went literally around the world as one of the most popular songs of the early part of the century.
Let's sing that song, Ron.
No, would love to sing that song.
Sing a verse of it. Give America.
Dennis, for those who might not be familiar with the song, it's "Come on, you rounders, if you wanna hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was the rounder's name. On the 6-8 wheeler boys he won his fame. Caller called Casey about 4:30. Kissed his wife at the station door. Mounted to the cab cabin with his orders in his hands. Took his farewell trip to the promised land. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin. Casey Jones with his orders in his hands. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin. Who took his farewell trip to the promised land.
Now America knows that.
Well, they know we can't sing it either.
I don't think most record stars have any threat. You guys.
But I mean, that's what happened was that song literally became is a part of American folklore and history, and
to people around
the world.
I was going to say, to people around the world, it paints a very heroic picture of that era.
Absolutely, it really does, and of course, there's a lot of what's interesting about this too, which we have a lot of fun with, is that there's controversy around the wreck because a lot of people say that in the official railroad report faults Engineer Jones for disregarding the signals of Flagman Newberry, who supposedly went 10 telegraph poles back and laid out torpedoes and fusees and flares for him to see. Well, Sim Webb, the fireman who was there that night in the cab, said shortly after the accident for the rest of his life, we never saw a flagman. We never saw the torpedoes or heard the torpedoes or saw any flares. And so no one will ever know what happened, but what we do know is Casey Jones did stay at his post trying to slow down, died a hero's death, and we think that's worth honoring in the historic Casey Jones home here today.
Well, I want to thank you both for having me here. Jib, one other thing you wanted to add?
I just wanted to say that Casey Jones ballad was a top 10 on the hit parade for over 10 years in the early 1900s. So we want to make that continue, you know?
I want to thank you both for having us here. It's a marvelous place. You're right on Interstate 40, about, 60 miles in from Memphis?
We're 80 miles from Memphis
80.
and 130 miles from Nashville, so it's a nice stop midpoint between those two cities.
And you're darn friendly here. I like that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks for
It's an honor having you. Yeah, thank you.
We appreciate you being here.
What a fun place to go. The heritage of Casey Jones, who was a genuine American hero. I'm Dennis Daly.